Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video, we're going to look at the ES-450 test data. And so a few months ago, I had introduced the 3D CAD files for this horn. This fits squarely in between the ES-290 and then the ES-600 in terms of physical size. And so it's typically used with a 15-inch base cabinet. And so we built these for a customer. This is solid birch. You can see it here. There's a number of design features that we incorporated into this particular build, which will be continued in further builds and designs. So the horn is actually secured with threaded rod. And so the picture is just shown. You can see the threaded rod poking out there. Now we need to still cut the threaded rod to length and then cover these holes with decals, which will be brushed nickel flush with the top of the horn. Also, there's threaded rods at the back here as well, and then there's a decal with the company logo going across the brushed nickel finish there to completely conceal the threaded rods. And then not shown as well is a gasket pocket between the two, which fully seals the top and the bottom half. So you can see there we've pocketed out as well when it was on the CNC. That's for the dowels for the super tweeter. So for this video, what we're going to do is just review the design quickly and then look at 3 different compression drivers and the test data results, looking at off-axis and distortion. Okay, so if you don't know, the ES Biradial is my own in-house design. It uses kind of an exponential flare that wraps around the horn mouth, and it does it both in the horizontal and in the vertical axes. The idea here is a very low coloration, low diffraction design for audiophile 2-channel music applications. And so the directivity is characteristically wide coverage, which narrows gradually and evenly as you move up into the upper treble. So the goal here with this horn is very even, well-behaved off-axis, and hopefully this size format, even though it's quite physically large, hopefully we can get wide coverage even into the upper treble, which would allow us to use it in a two-way application. Okay, so a few other features of the horn design, and this is something we come out with maybe a year ago, is the rear extensions, which extend out back past the horn compression driver. And so the idea here is to create a surface mount for the super tweeter, which would reside on top, and then it provides time alignment in the Z axis, so that you get good step response and good flat frequency response at the crossover point. Typically, with a horn like this, most compression drivers top out at around 8 to 10 kilohertz, and so you'd want to have a super tweeter coming in and filling in that kind of ambient, airy region of the upper treble. Another feature of the horn, not quite shown too well in this, but we've created at the back of the horn is a V pocket, and so it takes a rubber ball that's 1.75 inch diameter. And then at the front of the horn is so the horn's upside down in this image. At the front of the horn is 2 circular pockets to receive 1 inch diameter rubber balls. And so the horn for the first time sits on 3 rubber balls. And so you can adjust the rear ball diameter to provide some moderate downward tilt to the horn, and that's particularly useful with the 1798 base cabinet, which has the listening height a little higher than you'd like. And so providing some downward tilt to the horn, it points the horn directly at ear level at the listening position, which would typically be around 3 meters away. And so we recently did that in our setup, and it does provide a slight increase in sound quality having the horn directly pointed at you during normal listening. So for this test, we used a throat adapter from Eminence, and I'll put a link in the description there. So this is a 1.4 inch to 2 inch throat adapter, and these cast aluminum black painted units are relatively affordable, and they're a little longer than the stock adapters that come with the RCF compression drivers, and so it actually provides a little narrower throat angle, which actually is more geometrically aligned with the throat diameter going into the horn. And so it's actually a little bit more improved than the stock throat adapter that comes with from RCF, and that it provides an even smoother horn flare transition at the throat. So you can see it there. So we've tested the RCF ND950, which is a 100 millimeter diameter titanium diaphragm compression driver from Italy. We also have the SB Audience 65 CDNT shown here with the Eminence throat adapter, and I'm also including the 3D printed rear cover, which is vented and increases the rear volume there. And so this allows the compression driver to be used on this size of a horn, dropping the fundamental resonance, or FS, down below 450 hertz. I believe it's around 290 hertz FS with the rear cover. The third compression driver that we're testing today is the BNC DCM50 16 ohm version. And so there's no actual published data on this driver on the BNC website. The only thing that's published is the 8 ohm version, but I decided to buy for my own personal system the 16 ohm version after hearing the 8 ohm version for another customer. And so there is a very nice kind of paper character to the sound that's very dynamic, very transparent. So let's see how this compression driver does on the ES-450. Okay, so from the measurement side, we're going to start with the RCF ND950. And here's the product link for the throat adapter, which is the HA14-2. And so I've overlaid the impedance of the driver in red. It doesn't have the actual value on the vertical scale, but it does give us some idea of kind of easily telling what's happening if there's a correlation with the impedance sweep and the frequency response. And so so you can see here the lower part of the cutoff, we're getting extension actually down to 400 hertz, and we don't see any big blips near the cutoff of the horn that would indicate first order reflections. So the horn is actually doing quite well even down to the cutoff in terms of having a flat frequency response. And so it's relatively flat right up to the breakup of the, this is again a 4-inch titanium diaphragm. You can see here that the breakup starts to occur. You can tell actually more by the impedance there at around 9 kilohertz. We're starting to get some diaphragm breakup. But otherwise, there's a downward sloping falling response that's just very, very subtle. If we were to draw a line through there, it would be, you know, plus or minus 2 dB, which is quite respectable. Okay, so moving on to the SB Acoustics, I believe it's SB Audience, the division of SB Acoustics, the 65 CDNT. You can see here that we get a very nice flat frequency response. Again, nothing of concern near the cutoff of the horn. And then we do have this little bit of a blip here, which is characteristic of the driver itself. But otherwise, it's a very flat response until the breakup there, which is up at around 17 kilohertz. So I've tested this driver quite a few times in previous testing, and so this is one of the best measurements that I've seen from this driver, so definitely would be suitable on the ES-450. So next I tried the BNC DCM50 16 ohm. So you can see here that it's good loading down to the 400 hertz, but with it being paper, it's going to have a little bit of an irregular frequency response, and there is a bit of a shelf just after the 2 kilohertz, but then we see a rise again into the treble region, and then by 11 kilohertz it's starting to fall off. So 11 kilohertz from this particular type of diaphragm, which if you look at the previous posts I've done on the DCM50, it's a 5-inch cone type diaphragm, and it's using a pretty advanced phase plug in front of that diaphragm. And so we are getting pretty decent extension considering that this is a 5-inch paper type diaphragm. So a very interesting result. Next, I measured the off axis at 15, 30, and 45 degrees, and that was using the ND950. That was the one I had in at the time, which is going to give us good resolution into the upper treble. And so basically the horn is providing pattern control right down to the cutoff frequency, and the behavior off axis is virtually identical to the on axis response, which indicates virtually no coloration or edge diffraction artifacts that would smear or color the overall detail of the sound. So now I measured it at 5-degree increments to produce an off-axis colored polar map. And so surprisingly, you can see that we do actually get wide coverage right up to around 12 kilohertz where it does start to narrow. So overall, this was telling us that we can use the ES-450 in a two-way application, assuming that the compression driver is up to the task in terms of being able to provide that broad of a bandwidth from 450 hertz up to the upper treble region cleanly. So I measured the CSD plot on the ND950, and so you can see here it's an extremely clean plot other than some breakup there. The CSD plot for the 65 CDNT, again, extremely fast decay and very clean. We do notice that the blip there that we saw earlier at the 8 kilohertz, it is a little tiny bit of stored energy. With the 65 CDNT, when I do passive crossover designs for it, I have implemented a slight notch filter in that region to flatten the response, and it is subjectively slightly cleaner sounding when that's done. So just a note there. So here we have the DCM50 paper cone driver, like I mentioned, and so you can see the CSD plot is actually the cleanest of the three, with very, very low stored energy there at around the 10 kilohertz. Now, looking at burst decay, it's showing similar type of data, time domain, stored energy in the diaphragm. It's just showing it with the depth scale changed to periods instead of the time in milliseconds, and so it's probably a little more relevant in terms of the subjective offensiveness of the resonances. And so what I've found after testing dozens of drivers is that some resonances is okay because it just simply is not audible. If it's under around the 18 periods. However, here we see with the RCF that's extending well past the 18 periods. And so that is something that you can subjectively notice when listening. It brings on kind of a metallic sound character there in the upper treble. And so typically this large format compression driver would be used as a mid-range only because of that, and we can see that in the test data. So looking at the burst decay for the 65 CDNT, again, very clean result until we get to that 8 kilohertz, and then some severe breakup there in the 17 kilohertz region. And so for me, that's well past my own audibility, and so I simply don't notice that breakup occurring, and it doesn't seem to have a detrimental effect in the audible part of the frequency spectrum. So an excellent overall driver. Okay, so looking at the DCM50 burst decay in the upper treble, now we do see some stored energy, but if you look at its relative value, it's below 12 periods. And so that simply puts it quite below the audibility threshold for what I've observed. So an excellent result for that. Now, looking at harmonic distortion, I tested it just at the 85 dB test signal level, simply because what I found is that doing the 95 dB is a bit redundant, because you can just simply calculate the amount of distortion from there. You're going to lose 10 dB of distortion performance when and it seems to be very consistent in terms of drivers that I've tested, and so it simply is not really worth doing. But for the 85 dB on the RCF, looking at the 1 kilohertz region, we have H2 at 0.07%, with the higher orders being extremely low at 0.205 and 2045. So very, very, very low numbers. And another characteristic too is just the fact that the distortion profile across the spectrum is very even, and that it's predominantly second order. Looking at the 65 CDNT, the distortion is actually quite comparable to the RCF with the it looks identical, right, if you compare the two graphs. So they're basically on par for sound quality. Now, looking at the DCM50, the overall value is similar again for H2, but one characteristic that we see is that the higher order harmonics in the upper treble is extremely low, and we'll touch on that in a bit. So looking at IMD there for the RCF ND950, so again, kind of the characteristic noise profile that you see with the various compression drivers that I've tested is extremely low IMD in the lower part of the mid-range, and then it gradually rises, particularly where the breakup occurs. But overall, excellent performance here. And then with the SB Audience 65 CDNT, very similar results again, extremely low distortion, but we do see IMD remaining quite low into the upper treble, which makes the 65 CDNT suitable for 2A applications. Now, measuring the IMD for the DCM50, you can see even lower distortion in the lower mid-range, and then we see a rise in the upper treble there, but contextually we also see a rise in the output in the upper treble, and so really the distortion is remaining low. It's just that we're seeing an increase in output in that region. Okay, so looking at Gedley distortion, or GM, I measured at both the 85 and 95 dB test signal. And so we get an idea of its distortion performance, with the Gedley metric being 0.002 for the lower test signal. And so for the SB Audience, we can see that it doesn't do quite as well as the RCF. And then, did I not do the DCM? I don't think I did. I jumped on to listening evaluations, so sorry for that, not including that. So looking at the DCM, while I was doing this testing, I decided to play around a bit with this driver, and I threw in a capacitor just to see kind of subjectively what it sounded like. And to my surprise, just with listening to music, I had installed a 6.8 microfarad capacitor, and it actually sounded really nice, even into the upper treble. I was barely detecting any lack of upper treble detail. And so when I did a frequency response measurement comparing the effect of the capacitor, you can see here that we're getting a pretty flat response through the mid-range, and then into the upper treble we have a nice little kind of presence boost there, that's kind of masking the fact that the driver doesn't extend much past 11 kilohertz. And so it kind of gives you a sense that it is producing the complete treble range, and the treble that is there is actually incredibly I'm not good on subjective descriptions, but it just sounded wonderful, beautiful tonality, very detailed, delicate sounding, and it had no kind of the typical metallic sound character that you get with other regular dome type compression drivers. And so it was just really interesting as far as the overall vocal clarity. It had kind of a warm presence to it, and just sounded so correct on many levels. And so this became something that was interesting to me, and so I continued to do further measurement. And you can see here the actual distortion levels for the upper treble for the driver. And so I've just highlighted here where we're at in terms of the higher order harmonics with H3 and H4. You can just see these values are like just right into the noise floor of many electronics, even really good amplifiers and that. And so it kind of highlights and correlates very strongly with the subjective listening and how good it was sounding in my test setup. So I believe I touched on that enough. Also, I guess I'm showing here the amount of dynamic range with the multi-tone test, and so we are seeing 68 dB of dynamic range for the upper treble. And also making a comment about the way that the burst decay is or the CSD plot is quite clean on that driver, where you're not seeing the characteristic breakup occurring that you see with other types of drivers. So we set up, actually, I want to mention we have a new listening space that we're using. A local audiophile has agreed to allow me to use his space, and he gets to enjoy whatever speakers I have set up at that time. And so we have the 1798 bass cabinet with the ES-290 and then the T900A. And so just setting it up with the DCM 50 and coming in, playing right up into that upper treble, and then using the T900A just to kind of come in and provide a little tiny bit of air there. It's just a really good solution, I find, and so it's incredibly smooth. We set up the amplification initially with some Class A/B push-pull tube amplification, and decided that the bass quality just wasn't there, and so we switched to some Emotiva XPA1 mono blocks, which are I think around 500 watts in Class A/B and 60 watts in Class A. And so that really introduced a jump in sound quality, and the overall system, even though there was no tubes in the system, it was sounding incredibly tube-like. And so I attribute that to the fact that we have the AE drivers with the full the copper sleeving there, and then the DCM with the paper, and I believe it also has the copper shorting rings. And then the T900A is an Alnico super tweeter, and I'm going to show that in a future video, where I had come up with a pretty good high pass filter for that particular stock super tweeter, which gives it a very nice flat response starting at around 10 kilohertz. And so without that filter, the super tweeter had some limitations, but with the new high pass filter, which is a fourth order, actually really made that tweeter just sound very pure and very accurate with incredible detail. So I'll feature more on that to come. So just with my subjective ranking on the DCM 50, I have it basically 10 out of 10 on soundstage depth, 10 out of 10 on smoothness, 10 out of 10 on vocal clarity, and then 10 out of 10 on accurate musical timbre. Sense of dynamic range, I would say this is the one area where the DCM 50 kind of falls short. With the titanium diaphragms, you get a really kind of forward, real on the leading edge of transients, you have a real kind of snappiness to it. This is a little more compressed, I would say, but it's so subtle, still gets 9 out of 10. So just conclusion on the ES-450 Biradial itself, you can see we have a very linear frequency response. At least the horn is capable of that with the appropriate compression driver. In this case, the 65 CDNT, showing a very linear response. The directivity gradually narrowing and providing still wide coverage there in the upper treble. So overall, the ES-450 fills in the gap size difference between the ES-290 and the ES-600. And so it's been optimized, like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, for use in a 15-inch type size bass cabinet. There's a variety of drivers that can work with the ES-450, particularly when you use the Eminence HA14-2 throat adapter, which is used to accommodate the 1.4-inch compression drivers. And like I mentioned, the throat adapter keeps a smooth transition at the throat angle, so sound quality is not compromised when you're using that throat adapter. So I think I covered as much as I could. Pretty comprehensive review. So let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and email me if you'd like a custom build. So take care and have a great day.